thank you for joining us for the evolution of the secret city, a fireside chat about the Hanford story. Or should I say, good evening, friends, which is how President Roosevelt started more than 30 fireside chats. So my name is Amy Basche. I'm the Chief Operations Officer with Mission Support Alliance. And I'll just put a little background or history for you. So in the mid-1940s, a project that would alter the course of World War II, and it was all done in secrecy. So as history was unfolding, the site that's now known as Hanford was put in place to produce plutonium for the development of nuclear bombs. The atomic bomb that contributed to the end of World War II, and after that, the continuation of plutonium production lasted for about 40 years out at the Hanford Site. So tonight you'll hear why the Army Corps of Engineers selected Hanford for its site and what the mission was. And you'll hear about how the Department of Energy and its cleanup contractors are utilizing the site today and using first-of-the-kind technology, innovation to help clean up the site and be able to turn much of the site back for future generations' use. So Mission Support Alliance, I'll just give you a little history. We are, I consider myself kind of the city manager of the little city called Hanford. So we provide the basic infrastructure to the Department of Energy and the other Hanford contractors. So we provide the power, the water, the sewer, the telephone services, the patrol services, the fire services, all so that the other Hanford contractors can focus on their mission of safely cleaning up the legacy of Hanford waste. A couple of things as we move on tonight. So Leidos, as you've seen through the establishment here tonight, Leidos is the managing partner of Mission Support Alliance and is proud to present the incredible panelists that are going to be introduced to you in just a few minutes. So again, all to discuss the evolution of our secret city as we celebrate the 75th anniversary of Hanford. So here to present the panelists is David Reeploeg. So David is the Vice President of Federal Programs with the Tri-City Development Council, and he's going to be the moderator this evening for the panel. And for those of you that don't know David, David formerly served for Senators Murray and Cantwell. And what you may not know is David was born and raised in Richland. His mother worked out at the Hanford site for her career, and so he, I'm certain, has some additional perspective that he's going to be able to share with you tonight if you have questions. And so without further ado, David, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Amy. And let me also extend my welcome to all of you. For our version of a fireside chat, let me introduce the individuals who will chat with us tonight, sharing their thoughts and stories. First, I would like to introduce Dr. Eric Boyle. Dr. Boyle is the Chief Historian for the U.S. Department of Energy in Washington, D.C., serving in this role since 2016. His work focuses on the history, preservation, and archives for the department and its predecessor agencies. Eric is also currently a lecturer at the University of Maryland and previously was Chief Archivist with the National Museum of Health and Medicine. Next, I'd like to introduce Mr. Greg Jones. Greg is acting Deputy Manager and the Assistant Manager for Budget and Finance for the U.S. Department of Energy Richland Operations Office and Chief Financial Officer for the Hanford Site, so he's very busy. He is responsible for all the people, money, and contracts that support Hanford cleanup. Greg was the Executive Officer for the Department of Energy Office of River Protection from 2000 to 2004. He began his federal career in 1995 and previously served as a Kennewick City Council member. Next, we have retired Congressman Doc Hastings, who served as the U.S. representative from Washington's 4th Congressional District from 1995 until his retirement in 2015. He also served in the Washington House of Representatives from 1979 to 1987. Before his political career, Doc ran his family-owned small business, Columbia Basin Paper and Supply in Pasco, which is still in the family. Next, we have Mr. Mike Lawrence. Mike was the manager of Richland operations for the U.S. Department of Energy from 1984 to 1990. He started his career in Washington, D.C. at the Atomic Energy Commission in 1968 in the Commission's production division with responsibility for Hanford. Mike later worked for the U.S. State Department in Vienna, Austria, and the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, and was the managing director for the UK Nuclear Lab. And last, we have Mr. Jack Briggs. Jack worked at the Tri-City Herald for nearly 40 years, spanning many decades of the Cold War and the related booms and busts at Hanford that impacted the Tri-Cities. He was a reporter from 1960 to 1985, editor from 1985 to 1992, publisher from 1992 to 1997, and a member of the Herald editorial board until 2012. Jack came to the Tri-Cities from a newspaper job in Idaho, and as you'll soon hear, he hails from England. And with that, I'd like to begin our questions. So this first question begins with Eric, and the question is, how were the Manhattan Project sites selected, particularly Hanford? And can you also talk about how the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers' structure of creating the unique Manhattan District helped to camouflage the atomic bomb's development, leading to the creation of the secret cities?
So those are both great questions, and I could probably stand up here or sit up here and answer them for the next 30 or 40 minutes, but unfortunately I need to make it quick. But I think arguably the key factor in both of those questions was the fact that by the time that President Roosevelt approved the Manhattan Project in 1942, the country was at war. And so national security and secrecy were both top priorities in both areas. And so in terms of deciding on how to create the project, one of the initial decisions that was made that was based in large part on those priorities was to grant responsibility for the project to one single branch of the armed forces, the Army. And within the Army Corps of Engineers decided to continue a tradition that existed in the naming of major projects at that point in time, where they named the project based on the site office that was responsible for coordinating and organizing the work. And as it happened, the initial work that was done for the Manhattan Project was done in Manhattan, and so it got the name the Manhattan Engineer District. So the additional benefit of that was it camouflaged the fact that ultimately the Manhattan Project did a lot of work outside of Manhattan, all over the country at various sites, but simply looking at the name of it, no one would ever necessarily guess that. Now, in terms of site selection, the selection of the initial site in Oak Ridge, Tennessee was in part based on those priorities of national security and secrecy, but there were also more pragmatic or practical considerations. You needed a supply of water, you needed enough electricity, you needed a place that was remote, somewhat remote. You needed a place ideally that had some sort of geographical features that lended itself to increased security and secrecy. And ideally, you wanted to be close enough to a place that had transportation lines and potentially a labor force to do all the work that needed to be done. But by the end of 1942, people realized pretty quickly that Oak Ridge didn't have enough of those things in order to accommodate a new plutonium plant. And so in December of 1942, General Leslie Groves, the head of the Manhattan Project, made finding a site for this new plutonium production plant a top priority. So within a couple weeks, he was presented with some options extending everywhere from the Great Lakes to the West Coast, and a list of priorities were drawn up in order to find the best site. So in addition to national security and secrecy being priorities, they needed a site that was big, right? Because ultimately, the plan was to build 3 to 4 reactors and 2 processing plants. And so based on the calculations that were made for appropriately spacing those buildings in order to ensure safety and security, they estimated they needed roughly 200 square miles. So they needed a huge chunk of land. So there were a lot of sites around the country that had that land available. But the big determining factor for Hanford was they also needed a site that had enough water and enough electricity. And so the site narrowed in on the Columbia River Valley and in the northwest, and in the southwest along the Colorado River. And ultimately, Hanford looked like it was the best choice. The Columbia River, along with the Grand Coulee Dam and Bonneville Dam, provided enough water and electricity. The site was big enough that it could accommodate all the facilities. It was far enough from large populations, at least, large population centers. If there was some sort of accidental release of radioactive materials, it wouldn't end up affecting a major population center. And then the added benefit for Hanford specifically was the geology of the area. Not only did it have a good basalt foundation, but it also had shale and sandstone that would provide material for gravel for roads and concrete aggregate for building all these major buildings. And so by January, the end of January 1943, Groves had pretty much decided that Hanford was going to be the best place.
Now, Dot, you grew up in Pasco around this same time period, not to date you, but what was the Tri-Cities like in the 40s and 1960s?
Well, actually, David, it was right after the war. However, I think it was probably the same. But Pasco became the commercial center of the Tri-Cities. And at that time, keep in mind, 1943, there's no commercial air traffic into this area at all. The only way you could get to the Tri-Cities would be by driving in or by train. And the only workable train depot was in Pasco. So everybody that came to the site had to come through Pasco. And as a result of that, in the late 40s and the 50s that I remember more clearly, Pasco clearly was the commercial center of the Tri-City area. Ken Oak had a commercial center, and of course Richland did not because it was the atomic city. But I remember, gosh, in growing up in the 1950s, in downtown Pasco, there was a Ford dealer, there was a Chevrolet dealer, a Pontiac dealer, there was a Nash dealer, a Plymouth dealer. This is all in downtown Pasco, and I might have missed some. There were men's clothing stores, there were women's clothing stores. There were a number of restaurants, and probably the focal point of all of that area during the 50s and early 60s was the Elks Lodge in downtown Pasco. In fact, President Truman came in here and dedicated that Elks Lodge, just to give you an idea of the significance of that. And I remember hearing people over the years saying, gosh, we can't wait for the weekend to come into Pasco. In fact, the merchants in Pasco stayed open until 9 o'clock Monday nights to accommodate traffic, and also stayed open until Friday night until 9 o'clock to accommodate the traffic. And unfortunately, it was that way until Columbia Center came into being, but Pasco clearly was the commercial part of the Tri-Cities at that time.
So we talked a bit about what it was like to live in the Tri-Cities during this era. Eric, can you talk more about what it was like to work out at the Hanford Site?
Well, I think in a lot of ways, Hanford certainly created opportunities for people that weren't available previously. And people came from all over the country to work at Hanford. And so, and there was all type of work to be done. So it's hard to, I think, generalize what it was like to work at Hanford, because if you were on the construction crew, it was going to be a dramatically different experience than if you were running the reactor. And so I think, generally speaking, though, what Hanford did, in addition to creating opportunities for people, was it was certainly a challenging environment to work in as well. In large part because, as I mentioned, there was this veil of secrecy that employees were expected to work under. And so I think that there was certainly a lot of stimulating work going on, a lot of interesting work going on for people. In many cases, a very high pressure situation to be working under as well. And so I think certainly there were both positive and negatives to Hanford in terms of it being a workplace.
What people sometimes overlook is especially during the Manhattan Project era, the focus was winning the war, was beating Germany to build the first nuclear bomb. And so I'd imagine that must have been just a tremendous amount of pressure. Well,
but that's the thing, is most people, the vast majority of the people who were doing the work during the Manhattan Project had no idea that's what they were doing. So they were certainly under a lot of pressure in terms of meeting deadlines. I think everyone was aware that the work they were doing was part of the war effort, but very few people knew exactly what that meant. And so it wasn't until after the bombs were dropped that most people who worked at Hanford realized that what they had been doing for the previous time had all been directed at that specific ultimate goal.
I think one of the other things that's important to think about it when we talk about the Hanford Site and the Hanford Site history, first, before the Manhattan Project came, was the rich tribal history of the Hanford Site and of this region, but also of the women who worked at the Hanford Site during the Manhattan Project era, and also of the African Americans who worked at in a segregated time period at a segregated site, and the women who worked at a time when gender roles were very strictly defined in most cases, and I'm sure was very, very challenging. But the community and things have evolved since then, and that's a good segue to Jack. Obviously, Hanford was a key factor in the growth of the Tri-Cities, yet it came in booms and busts. What was life like as a member of the community and as a reporter during all the ups and downs that came every few years, and what caused them?
Well, things have been fairly placid in the last couple of decades, but before then, the Tri-Cities, as many of you know, had more of its share of ups and downs than any place else, I think, in the country. And there was a tendency, though, and there still is a tendency, to believe that all those booms and busts were associated with Hanford, and they're not. A lot of them were associated with farming. Some of them were associated with labor strikes and stress, and some of them, too, with the nation's and the state's economy as it relates to energy needs. And the first boom, although it was a very small one, came in the 1880s when the new state of Washington was looking for a capital. And believe it or not, one of the leading contenders was Pasco. Pasco at that time had 400 people. Its streets were sandy trails. Any sidewalks it had were loose planks, and all the houses were grouped around the railroad depot. Yet 20 to 30 trains were arriving in Pasco every day, many of them filled with settlers who came to this area, lured here by Burlington Northern and its offer of cheap land and impossible returns. So the settlers came here, they found that instead of soil, they got sand. Every ditch that they dug to carry their water leaked like a sieve, and they all headed home. And the population of the three towns dropped by about half within a few years. Then along came 1942, and we've talked about that, and I'm not going to cover that. The Herald arrived in town in 1948, about the time the Tri-Cities was going through the first Cold War boom, building the reactors along the river. The Herald tried to get an office in Richland, and Milt Seidel, who was the AC public relations officer, said to the publisher, quote, "We don't think you'll make good neighbors," period, and turned them down. People were living in tents. They were living in their cars. If they said that they were living in chicken coops, they probably were. The Kennewick and Pasco each had one hotel. Stays were limited to 3 nights. Cafes, they had lines up all the way down the street. All water and sewer facilities were overtaxed. The sanitary conditions in the Tri-Cities were said to be the worst in the nation. Less than a mile from where we are right now, a man was selling multiple occupancies in a tent, and the leg of each bunk was in a can of water to stop the rats getting at the sleepers. So what were things like then? It was a roller coaster ride of booms and busts, seemingly over 10 years, with many wondering if their jobs would ever last. When I arrived in the Tri-Cities in 1960, problems were brewing. The Tri-Cities was being struck by the strong International Typographical Union, which in essence put $3 million into running a competing newspaper in Pasco called the Columbia Basin News. The government was coming to the conclusion that the nation was awash in plutonium and was thinking about, why do we need all those reactors on the river? And they started shutting them down one at a time every year. And that caused the booms and the busts and the roller coaster rides. GE gave up its exclusive contract to operate Hanford, and the fear was that Hanford was going to blow away. Remember, this was the time when there were two bridges across the Columbia River, both of them from Pasco to Kennewick. One of them was in such terrible shape that if you ran a car over it, your next stop had to get a new wheel alignment. There was no interstate highway. All that traffic was run through a one-lane underpass just outside of Baker. It took 7 hours to go to Boise. At Umatilla, there was no bridge. It was a ferry. When you drove to Spokane, you meandered through all these small little towns between Pasco and Spokane. But living here at that time, there was often a cloud of brown nitrous dioxide fumes hanging over especially Kennewick, all from the Finley fertilizer plant. Air inversions clouded the Tri-Cities with a putrid smell from the Wallula plant, and Richland welcomed its people to town with its beautiful Rose Bowl sewer plant as you cross the Yakima River. So what was it like to live here at that time? It was isolated, uncertain, windy, dusty, and smelly.
And you talked, Jack, about how the booms and busts have largely subsided over the last decade or two. And can you talk a little bit more about who played the role of champions to try to evolve our community beyond that cycle?
You know, there were many champions of diversification, but I think the two names that have to stand out are Glen Lee, owner and publisher of the Tri-City Herald, and his implementer, Sam Volpentest. They were helped by a whole bunch of Tri-Dec teams, and our local representatives in DC. Everyone can still remember Sam, but Glen died in the 1980s, so I'd like to talk a little bit about him because he was a very key guy. Glen and his partner, Bob Phillip, had a very successful export-import business in Seattle, and their main item was flour. So in 1948, they came to the Tri-Cities to buy a flour mill. Instead of that, they bought the Pasco Herald, a daily newspaper, for $80,000. A year later, they spent on $40,000 of borrowed money to move it to Kennewick into a dilapidated and bankrupt pea cannery. And surprisingly enough, that pea cannery remained the core of the Tri-City Herald building until 2004. It was a terrible place to work. Glen was the forceful partner of that. He was a very forceful guy with a sense of the jugular and a rifle-like aim at anything that needed to be done to build the Tri-Cities. He was also writing regular columns at first and getting into a lot of libel suits. And his libel attorneys told him, stop writing those columns. Our paper for many, many years, the headline on page 1 was always printed in red. And our detractors said it was printed in the blood of our victims. Glen didn't like attorneys. So we as reporters were not allowed to use the names of attorneys in trial stories or on stories about suits that were filed. And if you can imagine the problems of writing something and not being able to identify the principal players in it. Glen also didn't like the way in which the Washington Public Power Supply system was numbering its reactors. And they weren't numbering them in numerical order. So Glen decided that we were going to renumber them for whoops. So in our stories, we were ordered to name whoops 2 as not whoops 1, and whoops 3 became whoops 4, and whoops 4 became 2, and all the way down to 5. So the reporters didn't know what they were writing, and the readers didn't know what they were reading. But Lee, and he was a great guy, but he was a man of contrast. He almost fired a reporter for spending $2 on fish food for the aquarium in one of the offices. Yet when he sold the paper for $36 million in 1978, he shared $1 million of that with all employees. Going back to '62, Lee feared a shutdown of Hanford and feared that the Tri-City was going to blow away with it. So he formed what was called TRICNIC, which Tri-City Nuclear Industrial Council, which later became Tri-Dec, to diversify the economy. Lee was working through Sam Volpentest, who was the bag man for two very powerful senators, both of them from Washington State. Warren Magnuson was chair of the Budget Committee, and Henry Jackson was chair of Appropriations. So Magnuson could budget the money, and Jackson could spend it, and they spent a lot of it on Hanford. And one of the things they did when GE went out of there was they forced the new contractors to bring in something that would diversify the economy. So that way we got the Sandvik Special Metals plant in Finley, we got the meatpacking plant at Wallula, and the Red Lion, it was the Desert Inn in Richland. Without Lee and his friends in Congress, many things would not have happened. For example, there'd been no federal building in Richland. The interstate highway would have cut south directly from Yakima to the river, totally bypassing the Tri-Cities. The Columbia Basin Irrigation Project would have dried up long before it did. Governor Dan Evans would have stopped most of the corporate farming that now covers the Horsehaven Hills. And the FFT project would never have been built for us to argue about it 20 years later. How successful was the attempt to diversify the economy from what, remember, is being classified, I think, by the government as a closure project? Employment is up, unemployment is down. The cherry orchards and apple orchards are being replaced by housing developments. Food processing has become a big part of the Tri-City economy. But has diversification been as successful as it would have been, as it could have been? I think we're going to be talking about that a little later.
So fast forwarding, operations at Hanford continued through the 60s and through most of the 80s, plutonium production. But Mike, you started in Washington, D.C., and what was Washington, D.C.'s perspective of Hanford in the 60s, 70s, and 80s?
Well, I think a little bit of perspective is necessary, and based upon what Eric said, you have to remember when Hanford was built as part of the Manhattan Project, these were all first-of-a-kind facilities. They didn't know if they would work, so they had to be flexible, they had to be spread out for safety, and they were all first-of-a-kind, so they really had to be trying out new technologies. And consequently, they got a number of them right. Just really, really well, and a number of things that even later, when they turned out to be wrong, like the single-shell tanks leaking, the degree of safety they went to build tanks like that in the first place was remarkable for the time frame. Nevertheless, after the end of World War II, new reactors came along and they were built, but then the Russians and the Soviet Union developed their atomic bomb, and there was a bigger effort to expand the nuclear capability of the country. And so in the early 1950s, the Savannah River plant near Aiken, South Carolina was built. Now, DuPont originally built the Hanford plant, and then it turned it over to GE later. DuPont also built the Savannah River plant. And when they built the Savannah River plant, all the lessons learned from Hanford were then incorporated into the Savannah River plant. And whereas Hanford had used multiple flow sheets for chemical processing, there was only one at Savannah River. And that's why they're vitrifying waste today, and we're still trying to grapple with the fact that our waste is so diversified and how to deal with it. Their reactors were also very specific for producing plutonium and other specialized isotopes. So consequently, when Savannah River came online, it became the preferred site for the AEC. And the reasons were that they had those specialized facilities, and they were more reliable, actually, and more efficient than Hanford. But also, from a very practical point of view, the communications were so much easier with Savannah River than with Hanford. I would come into the office 8:15 in the morning, and my boss would already have been on the phone with the Savannah River site manager for half an hour talking things over, and it would take another 3 hours before he could call up Richland and talk about Hanford. So there were some very practical things about that. So consequently, when those shutdowns that Jack was talking about occurred, they disproportionately, they were happening here at Hanford. The older reactors were being shut down. And if it weren't for the efforts of Tricknick and people like Glen Lee and Sam Volpentest, we wouldn't have gotten the N reactor and wouldn't have been able to maintain the facilities that we had. So when I started with the Atomic Energy Commission in 1968, I actually shared an office with the person who was responsible for Hanford plutonium production. His name was Frank Self. He hated this place. And the reason he hated this place was, if you recall, N reactor was a very unique reactor. It was a dual-purpose reactor to produce both plutonium and steam that the Washington Public Power Supply System would use to produce electricity. Now, not to get too down into the weeds, but if you want to produce plutonium for national defense, you have to do that on very short production cycles, starting the reactor up, shutting it down every 45, 60 days. If you want to produce power, you want it to run as long as you can, like Energy Northwest going for 18 months before a shutdown. So consequently, trying to do both led to very inefficient operations. Furthermore, the fuel, instead of reprocessing it here at the Hanford site at Purex, they decided that they would help commercialize the fuel reprocessing industry, and they would ship the fuel from N-Reactor all the way across the country to West Valley, New York, where a new company was trying to do reprocessing. So consequently, the AEC and subsequently IRTA and DOE didn't have the highest regard for Hanford. And if it weren't for the efforts of people out here to keep the facilities going, and that was important for diversification, I don't think we would have had the success that we had in maintaining the community all those years.
Now, all this time, Jack, you were a reporter. What was it like to cover Hanford news and work through its veil of secrecies? What were the frustrations?
For a long time, of course, there were no laws that forced disclosure, and the best sources were anonymous ones. And mine was a cat. And let me explain. One day I got a call from someone who was obviously very high up in what was the AEC at that time. I think it was the AEC. And he gave me a lead on what turned out to be a fantastic story. And then he kept on calling me on a regular basis for months. And I thought, I've got to name this guy. I've got to have a name for him. So I named him Oscar after our cat. And my kids and wife knew that if Oscar ever called, they had to go and find me real fast. I never did find his name. At one time, I told him that I thought I knew who he was. And he said, if you ever get anywhere close, you'll never hear from me again. So I stopped looking. Mike Lawrence, to his credit, did usher in a much better press relationship. Some things have changed and others haven't. Contractor churn and headquarters instability adds to problems of coverage. But some of the problems we have with covering Hanford now has got nothing to do with Hanford. It has to do with the fact that in Mike's day, the Tri-City Herald had 16 to 18 reporters. It's now got 5. And remember, those 5 are covering a bigger and more complex Tri-Cities than were the 16. It means reporters have less time to cultivate sources, and sources at a place like Hanford are the bread and butter of meaningful coverage. It means a greater reliance by the public on company handouts, and whereas companies used to basically had to convince the press or the electronic media to print whatever they had, they can now print it themselves through social media with less oversight.
Now, Mike, you did manage the Hanford site at a very important and a very interesting time. You began when plutonium production was still the priority at the Hanford site, and by the time you concluded your time, plutonium production was officially over and the tri-party agreement had been signed. So can you talk about the genesis of the tri-party agreement and how did it bring economic stability to the region? And can you talk about the political climate that set the stage for signing the agreement?
Well, as Jack's already alluded to, in the 1980s, when President Reagan came in, he decided to perform somewhat like a stress test on the Soviet Union by re-upping our plutonium production, our nuclear capabilities, and that led to the restart of the Purex plant, which had been shut down or in standby for a number of years. And it involved taking N-Reactor, which had been really not producing weapons-grade plutonium. It had been producing plutonium that was used in the development of reactors, and even that wasn't being reprocessed, it was being stored. And so we put Purex into operation, N-Reactor was up. Hanford was one of sites being considered for a geologic repository, and in the middle of that decade, it was selected as one of the 3 finalists. So there was a lot of attention on Hanford, a lot of negative attention on Hanford from those who were opposed to these activities. But the key event that led to the tri-party agreement was 1 year after I came here in 1985, there was a court case in Tennessee whereby it was decided and determined by the court that the Department of Energy and its facilities had to meet federal and state environmental rules and laws and regulations. Up until that point, that had not been a requirement. The AEC and its facilities, and then DOE and its facilities were self-regulated. So all of a sudden, one day we were in compliance, we were doing what we were allowed to do. The next day, we were breaking the law. And consequently, that put us in a situation where we really had to go to the state, go to EPA, and sit down and plea bargain, if nothing else, to say, look, we're in violation. How do we get into compliance? And of course, part of the problem with doing that is we don't earn the money to do it. We have to get the money from Congress, and so we're constrained in many, many different ways. But fortunately, somewhat because of some of the things Jack said, we did have a good relationship at that time with the state. We had Governor Gardner was in office. Christine Gregoire was the director of the Department of Ecology, and a person by the name of Roby Russell was the head of the regional office of the Environmental Protection Agency. So my staff here, along with met with the people of Department of Ecology and EPA in Seattle to try to work out how we were going to do this. And very early on, the EPA said, look, if you and the state could work things out, we're in, because we realize you've got the most difficult thing to do. And so over the course of 4 years, a number of people from my staff, Ron Izat, Jerry White, Ed Goldberg, others, all working very hard on a day-to-day basis with the state and with EPA. We really hammered out an agreement that would allow us to get into compliance, and the tri-party agreement, which is still being used today, is more or less the blueprint for how we get things done. We always knew that it was a guess as to what things could be done and couldn't be done and how long it would take, and it had to be flexible. But we did at least go ahead to do that. But the key event, which allowed us to get started on the tri-party agreement, and what led to that picture that everybody sees of the cake cutting when we signed the agreement, was right after the staff, we had all agreed on what we wanted to do. I was over in Olympia meeting with Chris Gregoire, and she said, now we want to take this to the court and have a judge bless it so it's got legal standing, and that's the way it'll go forward. And I pointed out to her, I said, I'd love to do that, but I work for the federal government, and our lawyer is the Department of Justice. They don't believe in friendly lawsuits. They will fight this. And if they fight this, there's no doubt in my mind, you're going to win. But it's going to be 2, 3, or 4 years from now when you win, and things won't get done between now and then. And so we went back and forth, and she said, no, we really do need to take it to the court. And I said, can we go talk to the governor about it? And she said, certainly. So the next week, go back over, Chris, myself, and Governor Gardner are all meeting, went through the same story several times, and finally the governor and Chris Gregoire decided, yeah, let's give it a try. And because of that, we were able to get started on the tri-party agreement, and we really made some really good progress. But without their willingness to do that, we would have been in court for years before the tri-party agreement ever got it started.
Well, and so many things happened during your tenure here as the Richland Operations Manager, Mike. From lifting the Veil of Secrecy, declassifying documents for public access, developing credibility for the Department of Energy. What would you say was your greatest challenge at that time?
Well, I think the greatest challenge was the fact that when I came here, there was no credibility. The department really didn't have any outreach, and the term transparency, which is used a lot today, there was no transparency. And I realized very early on that nobody was believing anything we said. So consequently, when decisions would be made or things would be done in the future, unless we could establish some openness and transparency, those things would be fought. So we did try things. We had monthly media coffees that Jack's wife Wanda would come to, where we would try on a regular basis to explain and say the things we were doing. We also established something called the Citizens Forum on Defense Waste. And it's interesting because just in today's paper or yesterday's paper was an article about the fact that there was opposition to leaving small amounts of radioactivity in the tanks. And very early on, I realized that was going to be a very difficult issue. If people wanted us to dig up and get every last atom out of the tanks, we'd never be able to do it. So we formed the very first citizens group to look at what we were doing, because I felt if we can't explain to them what we're doing and get agreement, then maybe we're doing something wrong. And I also recall at one point in time picking up the paper one day, and that morning Greenpeace had announced that they were sending their boat, the Rainbow Warrior, up the Columbia River, and they were going to anchor it off the Hanford site and take radiation measurements of the site. And I realized, well, wait a minute, we do this routinely. And the only thing we had to fear was bad measurements or the fact that they wouldn't interpret them properly. So what we did was I got together with the state and we invited Greenpeace for a three-way monitoring program. And that all was a way of diffusing some of these things. And I recall being told by staff, Greenpeace's equipment would never stay calibrated. Every time they'd take a measurement, the DOE, the state's measurements would come in, they'd match, and Greenpeace's would be off the map. But we were able to finally work that out so that we were able to overcome some of those things. So I guess the thing I'm most proud of, and the thing that hopefully is lasting today, is lifting that veil of secrecy. And even though Secretary O'Leary in the mid-1990s gets a lot of credit for opening up the whole department, basically everything she did, we were doing here in the 1980s, and I think that served us well.
My question to you, Mike, on that point, though, is there were all these competing priorities, and there were folks who did want to have a continued mission, whether that was a repository or continued production or whatever it might be. Can you talk about what that dynamic was like?
Well, yeah, there were many competing issues going on. The repository was one that I know I created a little bit of a stir, but I told people that basically if we found the Hanford site was not suitable, that would be a success, because the whole purpose of the program was to take 3 sites and to characterize each one, and then from the data you get, find out which one would be the best. And if you found a fatal flaw, you were still finding valuable information. I personally think one of the biggest mistakes the government ever made on the repository program, and I know Doc stays very much involved in trying to get things back on track there, is when the law was passed in 1982 for the repository program, it set in place a process where you would eventually have 3 sites, as I said, and get all the data and then choose between the 3. In 1987, Congress decided, no, because these were people who hadn't been involved back in '82, many of them, and they decided, no, let's just focus on Yucca Mountain. So I think the Yucca Mountain people do have a point when they said, this wasn't the process we signed up for. This wasn't what we expected to occur. So there was a lot of opposition to things like that. But even Sam recognized that the repository, there was a plus in terms of jobs, but it was also going to be a black cloud over the Hanford site as well. How are you going to attract more business and industry to the Tri-Cities if you've got a geologic repository there? So, yes, there were pluses and minuses, and there was some opposition to doing some things, but basically, I think it's turned out fairly well, the way it's turned out. And I think also because of the cleanup mission, and it's taking so long, but it's not a mission where you can make a decision to shut down a reactor today or do something tomorrow. It's got a long term to it, and while that long term is taking place and the money's being spent, the industry and the capabilities here are diversifying.
Mm-hmm. And you talked about Doc's time in office, and Doc, you were first a state legislator, not representing the 8th Congressional District, or Legislative District where the Hanford site is, but the next district over. And then when you came to Congress, obviously the Hanford site was part of your district. Can you talk about how Hanford was perceived, both at the state legislative level, but most importantly at the congressional level?
Well, when I was elected to the legislature in 1978, served the 8 years, I had the 16th district, which is essentially Franklin County to the east. The 8th district is still the district here that includes Hanford. And my seatmates at that time were Ray Isaacson, the late Ray Isaacson. Ray worked out at Hanford, and he knew this stuff very, very well. And Shirley Hankins was also, and she also worked out at Hanford. And so when there were decisions that were made related on the state level about Hanford, I relied on their guidance. And I think I got good guidance, frankly, from both of them. The biggest issue as it relates to the legislature in Hanford was the Washington Public Power Supply System, which went down, and everybody associated everything that happened with whoops was Hanford in total. And I think there still is that perception, frankly, across the state that people don't understand that. But the difference when I got elected to Congress was a little bit different in the fact that the cleanup was already going on here, albeit it had not started as well as it should. There are 4 major sites, cleanup sites in the country, Hanford, of course, being one, Oak Ridge, Savannah River, and Idaho. That is a pretty darn small constituency when you think about it, and it's pretty specialized in what it was doing. It just turned out that those that were elected in 1994 to represent those sites were all classmates of mine, and they're all Republicans. Lindsey Graham and Charlie Norwood was Savannah River. Charlie was in Georgia, late Charlie, and of course Lindsey is in South Carolina. Zach Wamp was from Texas, and he represented Oak Ridge, and of course I represented Hanford. And Mike Crapo from Idaho was in his 2nd term, represented Idaho. And so those are the 4 major sites. There were some other sites. So we decided that, being fiscal conservatives, that we knew this was a responsibility of the federal government to clean it up, because after all, it was the federal government that created it, albeit for a very good reason. We did win the Second World War because of the efforts, and the Cold War because of the efforts of these sites. So we decided that we needed to get together, the 4 of us, and figure out a way that we can do things together rather than having fights between the sites. I was told when I was first elected that, my God, Senator Thurmond is going to take all the money, you know, from Hanford at the last date. And so anyway, we sat down, had a meeting with Speaker Newt Gingrich. Newt, in his way, says, form a task force. So we formed a task force, and we call it the Nuclear Cleanup Caucus, and they anointed me as the chairman of that. And as a result of that, though, every year we had all of the sites come in on an educational basis to tell what is going on. And I think that had proved very helpful, especially in the early 2000s. But it was part, obviously it was policy, but there's a lot of politics in there because we were all brand new, and we have to figure out a way to make sure that we are worth. But I think the main challenge, and frankly it still is a challenge, is that there is not a large constituency of cleaning up these sites. And when you don't have a large constituency, it makes it pretty difficult. But I think the Cleanup Caucus, looking back, and it's still going on, I think has been a good part of at least smoothing out some of those edges.
Well, and speaking of today, and Doc, you also talked about some of the challenges that that you were dealing with in the 1990s and 2000s. We still have some cleanup challenges today. Hanford is one of the most challenging cleanup sites in the country, probably the world. There's some very unique work that's being done out there. So, Greg, kind of a two-part question for you. Can you talk about how the Department of Energy balances all the competing priorities, all the different work that needs to be done with, frankly, a limited funding stream to do all of it, and talk about some of the unique challenges that you face when you're trying to do the cleanup work?
Yeah, it's a real challenge. You know, we have an enduring, durable document in the Tri-Party Agreement. It's an agreement between Environmental Protection Agency, the Washington State Department of Ecology, and the Department of Energy. It's been a good document to work through. It gives us a roadmap and schedule on the cleanup we need to do. Of course, then we work it through our contractors. We get budgets. You know, we get funded annually. So we work then and put a budget together, and then we got to get Congress to buy into what exact work they want us to do each year. And that's kind of how it's determined. We have plenty of work cut out for us from now till quite a long ways in the future and quite a lot more work to do. But that establishment of the actual milestones and work that we have to do has really endured from really 1989 to now. There's been a lot of flexibility in the Tri-Party Agreement based upon different work, different challenges. You know, we put some pretty good strategies in place to clean up the river corridor, and most of the river corridor, the outer area of the northern part of the site that's not in the Waldook Slope, but the southern part of the river, south of the river, I should say. And it's been a very successful cleanup. You don't always hear about all the work that has been accomplished. We have had a tremendous success in groundwater cleanup. We've had tremendous success in cocooning and interim safe stabilization of the reactors. You know, we got 6 of them done. That's pretty darn good. You know, we've pert near, as my grandmother would say. There's my Fireside chat note. But we've pert near cleaned up the entire 300 area. We left some facilities for the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory. We did it on purpose because they needed the lab facility. So we've had a lot of very successful cleanup. And I think that gets lost, because we do have a lot more to go. And as Doc mentioned, the key to it is we have to have constituency. You have to have an enduring constituency to continue to get this work accomplished, because there's a lot more to do in the tank mission as well as in the remainder of the Hanford site. One last point. One of the things we're trying to work on right now, putting some flexibility in the tri-party agreement, is there's some risks that really are maybe more in the out in the outer years. I'll use, for instance, we had not intended on doing anything with Purex Tunnel 1. You probably read there was a subsidence, which means small collapse in Purex Tunnel 1. We realized we better do something with this. So we worked on it. We worked with our regulators closely and determined that we better stabilize that particular tunnel so we don't have some kind of release, et cetera. We have a lot of other work like that we need to work with our regulators and our constituents and our congressional staff to put into play and maybe move some of it up. So we've worked with our contractors, put some risk evaluation. We're starting to share that with our Hanford Advisory Board, the regulators. We've shared it with our reporters to try and maybe get some of that work done more in the near term so we don't have any issues.
We're nearing the end of the time that we have for our panel, but this conversation has been about the evolution of the secret city and the Tri-Cities. The region and our community has evolved over the last 75 years, and we're still evolving. We will continue to evolve. So just very brief answers, but could each of you just provide your perspective on what's next? Where does the Tri-Cities go from here as we continue to evolve?
We have to find some way of continuing the diversification away from dependency on Hanford. We've got to remember they're still pumping $3.4 billion every year into this economy. The attempts that have been made so far, and you can list them all, the attempt by Fluor, the attempt of putting subcontractor demands into contracts, they haven't panned out as well as we had hoped, I don't think. It's a shame that Pacific Northwest National Lab and Battelle, they do tremendous work, but so much of that work goes away. Basically because that's where the money is. The investors want them close by. So I think we've got to continue forcefully finding some ways of finding meaningful diversification away from the Hanford base.
Looking out in the distance, I think two of the biggest problems facing humanity are going to be climate change and how you deal with that. And second is, how do you provide for the growing population? There are going to be an additional 2 billion people added to the Earth in the next 20 years. And they need energy if they're going to rise up out of poverty. And already there are billions of people today who don't have access to electricity. So generating energy without carbon emissions and providing that to the population and clean water are two critically important areas. And those are areas where Pacific Northwest National Lab has real sweet spots. And so consequently, I see an opportunity there. And as David, TRIDEC has the Mid-Columbia Energy Initiative to try to develop opportunities along those lines, clean energy, and providing electricity to the population. I think that's where opportunities for the future lie.
I would say, in reference to what Jack mentioned, that there's several $1 billion that's pumped into our economy. I can tell you in 1995, if there was a threat of a layoff out at Hanford or a blip out at Hanford, it would resonate throughout the whole community. Something like that happening right now does not resonate through the community like it did then. I mean, it's not rock. Listen, the Pasco I grew up in is not anything like the Pasco like now. Pasco is 61,000. I grew up in Pasco when it was 15. Same with Kennewick. There's a reason people are coming here to the Tri-Cities. I think the main reasons are, frankly, is that we don't have hurricanes. We don't have earthquakes here. We don't have all of those natural disasters, and people are starting to figure that out. Now, that doesn't mean that we ought to be complacent about where we're going. I think the National Lab, as Mike said, is a very good basis to start. But we have so much to offer here in a variety of ways. But you know, having grown up here in this area and now living back here now, I can tell you this is a great area. And as long as we allow you know, the freedoms that we have in this country to expand what we have here, I think we have a very bright future, because this is a great place to live.
I think economic diversification and Hanford cleanup kind of go hand in glove. We need to continue to make progress on Hanford cleanup so people have the confidence that the troubles and issues we have, contamination is contained, that it is dealt with properly, that we get the tank waste mission accomplished, that we continue to protect the groundwater. And part of that is we're going to have to continue to work with Pacific Northwest National Laboratory and other laboratories to come up with innovative ways to do cleanup more effectively, more efficiently, and hopefully a little less expensively in the future. And if we can get that done and keep that stable foundation done, I think we can attract more diversified economy. They go hand in glove.
Well, as the historian, I'm technically not allowed to talk about the future.
But you can move here, Eric.
Okay.
Pretty nice place.
But I think there are a couple lessons, a few lessons from history. One of them, I think, looking back, is that in many ways, I think the course of history for Hanford has been determined at multiple levels. It's in some ways been beholden to the whims of national politics or international affairs or priorities of state legislators or versus local officials. But I think ultimately, when things have been accomplished and when things have gotten done, it's when there's been a collaborative effort on all those levels and among the people that are part of the communities themselves. And so I think if we can encourage that type of collaboration in the future, I think that would be probably the best direction to go.
That's a nice way to end our conversation. Thank you to our panel members for an insightful and interesting discussion about the evolution of the Secret City, a fireside chat about the Hanford story.